application area and the numericals we'll discuss in the next class. Okay. Now, basically, what is Rivnitsky theorem? Okay. So for Rivnitsky theorem, our reference is Krugman. Okay. And follow Krugman.
স্যার কিছু বললেন?
স্যার আপনার কথাটা মাঝে মাঝে কেটে কেটে যাচ্ছে।
দেখো তো এখন ক্লিয়ার এসছে?
হ্যাঁ স্যার এবার ঠিক আছে।
হ্যাঁ স্যার, এবার আপনি প্রথমে কি বলছিলেন যে বুধবার কি ক্লাস নেবেন, পরের দিকে ক্লাস নেবেন, সেটা আরেকবার বলবেন। প্রথমে
এরকম
বুঝতে
তো কোনো কথাই
পারছিলাম
বলিনি,
না।
বুধবার নিয়ে কিছু বলিনি। বলছি আমি
তাহলে
এখন
আজকে
আগে একটু আমি ভেবেছিলাম ইন্ডিয়ান ইকো পড়িয়ে শুধু ফিনান্সিয়াল পড়াবো, কারণ যদি নীলাদ্রিদা অনেক সময় বলে তো ফ্রি থাকে তাহলে ভাবলাম ওদিকে সিইডি পড়াতে পারতো, কিন্তু নীলাদ্রিদা আগে সিইডি পড়াতে পারবে না। আর আমি তো ক্লাসটা আগে স্টার্ট করলাম, তাহলে আমি ইন্ডিয়ান ইকো একটু পড়িয়েই কি আর ইন্ডিয়ান ইকো পড়াবো, একটু ডেটা দেখে কিছু বলবো, বলে ওদের ছেড়ে দেবো। তারপর ওদের কখন নীলাদ্রিদা ক্লাস নেয়, তাই আমি একটা ট্রেডের একটা টপিক পড়াচ্ছি, ইন্ডিয়ান ইকো পড়াচ্ছি। পড়ানোর পরে আমি তোমাদের ফিনান্সিয়ালি কোর যে লাস্ট পার্টটা, ওটা ওই নোটটাকে আজকে কমপ্লিট করব, টার্ম স্ট্রাকচারের পুরো মডেলটা, ওটা 10 মার্কসের জন্য ইম্পর্টেন্ট। এবার ওটা কমপ্লিট করব, আর যাদের সিডি আছে ওরা আবার 9টার সময় সিডির ক্লাসে জয়েন করবে। বোঝা গেল?
ইয়েস স্যার।
স্যার অস্মিতা ক্লাসে রেকর্ড করতে
না,
বলেছিল।
কোনো রেকর্ড করা হবে না, আর কোনো রেকর্ডের কোনো ব্যাপার নেই। কেন, অস্মিতা কোথায়? কোথায়
স্যার
ও?
মেসেজ করেছে আপনাকে।
আরে মেসেজ করুক, কেউ বাড়ি নেই, কেউ বেড়াতে যাচ্ছে, ঘুরতে যাচ্ছে, মেসেজ করেছে মানে হঠাৎ ওর মনে হয়েছে 6:30 ক্লাসের সময় যদি কারো যদি মনে হয় যে আরে আমি একটু বলে দিই স্যারকে আমি বাড়িতে নেই, রেকর্ড করে কেন আমাকে, তাহলে আগে কেন ফোন করেনি, কি প্রবলেম, কোনো ইমার্জেন্সি বা কিছু? রোজ তো কারো না কারো রেকর্ডিং লাগেই। ওকে, রেকর্ডিং পাবে, বলবে রেকর্ডিং পাবে 1 উইক পরে, ঠিক আছে? এটা বলে দেবে স্যার রেকর্ড করছে, কিন্তু রেকর্ডিংটা তুই দেখতে পাবি 1 উইক পরে, এখন দেখা যাবে না, হ্যাঁ এখন সেন্ড করবে না, আমি পরের উইকে ক্লাস করবি তারপর, কারণ নেক্সট উইকের যে ক্লাসটা আছে এর সাথে এটার কোনো লিঙ্ক নেই। রিভনিস্কি থিওরেম, রিভনিস্কি থিওরেম রেফারেন্স ইজ ক্রুগম্যান। ক্রুগম্যান সেম চ্যাপ্টার, resources and output. Resources and output. Krugman. Page number. Chapter. Recommendation.
This talk is now being recorded.
Chapter 4. Two-factor model. Chapter 5, 8th edition two-factor model. 9th edition. Chapter 4. Sorry, 9th edition chapter 5 হবে two-factor model. আরে page number 61, PDF page 89, PDF page 89, chapter two-factor model, resources, comparative advantage and income distribution, that one, resources and output. Now what is Rivnitsky theorem? Rivnitsky theorem basically states that if your supply of any particular factor increases, suppose the country one produces X and Y both, where X is labor intensive, Y is capital intensive. Now, if the labor supply increases, then production of X rises, Y falls. Production of X rises, Y falls. Okay. Now take a note. The note means only for পরে নোটস লেখা এখন আর নোটস টোটস লিখে লাভ নেই নোটস পরে লেখা বেসিক কনসেপ্ট অফ রিড তো এখন নর্মালি একটু জেনে নাও পরে নোট যখন 10 ইয়ার্স লেখাবো তখন লিখে দেবো now normally what is Rivnitsky theorem? So Rivnitsky theorem basically the relationship between resources and output. Okay, resources and output. So it suggests that if country one produces X and Y, two different output where X is labor intensive and Y is capital intensive, then if our production of X, suppose labor, the supply of labor increases. So if the supply of labor increases, then our production of X rises because X is labor intensive goods. Similarly, if the supply of capital rises, then our supply of Y, because Y is capital intensive, then the supply of Y basically will rise. Okay, clear? So this is the basic concept of the Rivnitsky theorem. Okay. Clear? ছোট করে একটুখানি লিখে নিতে পারো বুঝেছি নাহলে পরে একটা নোট দেবো না এটা এটা এখান থেকেই করতে হবে তাই আচ্ছা এটা লিখে নাও এটা লিখিয়ে দিচ্ছি পুরো কোশ্চেনটা লেখাও না শুধু হোয়াট ইজ হেডিং দাও হোয়াট ইজ Rivnitsky theorem or states Rivnitsky theorem. বুঝতে পারছি না ওটা লিখিয়েছিলাম পরের দিন আবার থিওরেমটা লিখিয়ে দেবো কিছু রেডি করে রাখিনি আমি ভেবেছিলাম ক্লাস নেবে ঠিক আছে থিওরেমটা তো বোঝাই পরে লেখাচ্ছি suppose we consider any Edgeworth box diagram. Edgeworth box diagram. OX, LX, KX, OY, LY, KY. So here amount of labor is KX1 and LX1 in X sector, and number of labor and number of capital is LY1 and KY1. Okay, this is our amount of labor and amount of capital in sector X and amount of labor and amount of capital in sector Y. Okay, look, this line is flatter for X, that is K by L ratio is lower. On the other hand, here your K by L ratio is greater. So K by L ratio greater means this commodity, that is Y commodity, is basically our capital intensive, and X commodity is our labor intensive. Okay, clear? Now suppose the supply of labor increases. Okay, I'll show both. Suppose the supply of labor increases. So when your supply of labor rises, so horizontally you measure labor, so this line rises, X dash, increase in labor. Now we draw again a parallel line. Now it cuts this ratio line at point F. So look, at that point, labor in X sector rises, and if you extend, capital in X sector also rises. On the other hand, labor in Y sector reduces and capital in Y sector also reduces. So it is clear that when your labor capital both will increase in sector X, so it implies the supply of X basically rises and the supply of Y reduces. Very simple model. Very simple model. Okay. Clear? Suppose your supply of X increases. Supply of labor increases. So when your supply of labor increases, then the total number of labor, this area increases. Now we draw the same parallel line, same K by L ratio for X. Now this is your intersection point. Okay. So at that point, your labor is also greater, capital is also greater than the previous situation. So when capital greater, labor greater, so it implies your labor and capital, that means rises. So that means your production of X also rises. On the other hand, for Y production, now capital reduces, labor reduces, so the output level reduces. Up to this, okay? Huh? Up to this, any doubt? Okay. আবার বলবো বলবো তো অবশ্যই
স্যার আরেকবার একটু বলুন।
হ্যাঁ সে তো বলবো সেটা তো জানি রিভনিস্কি থিওরেম আচ্ছা একটা কাজ করো একটা জায়গায় একটু লিখে নাও এটা পড়ার জন্য পরে আবার আমি লিখিয়ে দেবো এভাবে লেখো রিভনিস্কি থিওরেম ইজ কনসার্নড উইথ দ্য ইফেক্টস Rivnitsky theorem is concerned with the effects of changes. Heading Rivnitsky theorem. Okay. Is concerned with the effects of changes in the relative supply of inputs on the relative output and prices of commodities.
স্যার আরেকবার বলবেন?
With the effects of changes in relative supply of inputs on the relative output and prices of commodities.
Inputs when the
Inputs on the relative output and prices of commodities. For example, if commodity X is labor intensive, and commodity Y is capital intensive, then an increase in supply of labor will lead to a rise in the production of commodity X. Will lead to for example, if commodity X is labor intensive and commodity Y is capital intensive, comma, then an increase in supply of labor will lead to a rise in the production of commodity X. And a fall in the production of Y. Okay. So that is just normal. Simply we explain what is Rivnitsky theorem. So see, first you take a Edgeworth box. Simple Edgeworth box. Now we take X, Y, X labor intensive, capital intensive. Look, this one basically we draw like this. This ratio line, that is our, this is nothing but our contract curve type, contract curve. Okay. In our book, they take linearity. But that's it, no problem. Okay. So this is the point. So labor in X sector, capital in X sector, capital in Y sector, labor in Y sector initially. Okay, key point. Now suppose labor increases. So when the supply of labor rises, you measure labor horizontally, extent, this is your OX dash. So just check, this is actually your KX1, KX2. So just check impact on the X sector. Capital rises, labor also rises. Okay. Capital rises, labor also rises. On the other hand, for Y sector, labor reduces, capital also reduces. So check your first line. Rivnitsky theorem is concerned with the effects of change in relative supply of inputs. So inputs are labor and capital. So L by K rises, relative supply of input changes. Okay, changes in the relative supply of inputs on the relative output. Now see the impact on the relative output. You know your X depends on Lx and Kx. Your Qx depends on. Your Qy depends on Ly and Ky. So at that point, if your labor and capital rises in the X sector, then ultimately production of X. So Lx rises, Kx rises. Production of X.
Right.
Or Ly falls, Ky falls. So production of Y
False.
falls. Eto impact. This is the impact. Okay. Now clear. Okay. So first thing is, this is the impact on your output. Impact on your output. Okay. No confusion. ঠিক আছে? Okay.
স্যার এক্ষুনি মুছবেন না।
না মুছছি না, কপি করে নাও। হলো? মুছলাম। So though ultimately your factor increases. Now what is the impact on your supply? Supply Qx, Qy, this is your production function. Okay. Initially, the ISO value line is tangent to PPC at that point. So this is our Qx1, that is your Qy1. This is called biased expansion. So question may come in terms of biased expansion without using the name that is Rivnitsky theorem. Now biased expansion means, now suppose with your given resources, this is your maximum X and maximum Y. Now suppose labor rises in the economy, labor rises. So since X is labor intensive, now labor is that is good factor. Suppose you produce only Y. So if labor rises, output rises. Suppose you produce only X, labor rises, your output rises. But this is actually the changing pattern. So why? Because X is labor intensive. So when X rises, the impact of change in labor is quite greater, quite higher, stronger on X compared to Y. But here this Px by Py line, it is same. So therefore, so see, Qx by Qy rises. So supply of inputs on the relative output. Okay. Here. So this is resources and output. That is when your resources rises, then if the resources is intensive in any particular product, then the relative supply of that product will rise. And the factor used in that particular sector will also increase. Okay. Clear? This is our PPC, initial tangency, the next tangency. Because we know where ISO value line is tangent to the PPC, this is our point of production. This is our point of production. Okay. Now if Y rises, then the diagram, that is sorry, if capital rises, then the diagram. Now, same example, suppose we consider the Y value increases. LX1, KX1, LY1, KY1. Okay. Now capital increases. So you measure capital means vertically. So when capital increases, this is your change. That is your vertical shape increases. So when your vertical shape increases, LX2, KX2. So labor falls, capital falls in X sector. And if we extend labor rises, capital also rises in Y sector. Okay, let's derive this. Because for numericals, maybe labor rises, maybe capital rises. So you have to draw your diagram on the basis of this. Okay. Clear? Hmm? Clear?
ইরেজ করবেন না।
না ইরেজ করছি না, পরের ওই ডায়াগ্রামটাই যাবো। তবে একটা ম্যাথস করে দেবো, রিজনেসকি থিওরেম শেষ, বাস। So now just vertical value rises, vertical distance. এবার ঠিক আছে, মুছলাম।
হ্যাঁ স্যার।
But next diagram, that is biased expansion. It's a biased expansion. So let's check qx, qy, p1, p1 dash. So this is your px by py line. Your point of equilibrium, qx1, qy1. Same logic. Now capital increases. Suppose you produce only x, op1 dash. Further capital rises, yes, our output will increase. Suppose we produce only y, then capital rises, yes, total output will rise. But y is capital intensive, so the increase in capital, increase in y and increase in x are not proportionate. So there is biased expansion in favor of y. Okay. So now your equilibrium, same parallel, there is no change in the px by py line. So your px by py line remains same. Okay. So একটু better করে দিই এখানে। Remain same. এদিকে চলে যাবে। Okay. So see, up to this clear or not? Then I'll add one portion. Okay. I'll add one portion to understand this matter. That is, actually there are two implications are there. Okay. In short, just note down two implications. Yeah. The theorem may be divided just to explain the concept of Rivnitsky theorem, the first note, no, first part is sufficient. The theorem may be divided into two propositions. Number one, if the same rates of substitution in production after the increase in supply of one factor is maintained,
স্যার আরেকবার একটু বলুন না।
if the same rates of substitution in production after the increase in supply of one factor is maintained, after the increase in supply of one factor is maintained, comma, this will lead to an absolute increase. This will lead to an absolute increase in the production of the commodity using relatively more of the factor and an absolute decrease in the production of the commodity
factor
and an absolute decrease in production of the commodity using relatively less of the same factor. Less of the same factor. So implication one is basically our explanation up to this. Implication one ta dekho, up to this we explain this one. দেখো কি বলছে, if the same rates of substitution in production after the increase in supply of one factor is maintained, this will lead, that is labor rises, so this will lead to an absolute increase in the production of the commodity using relatively more of the factor, that is here x. So when labor rises, x rises or capital falls, just vice versa. Now implication 2, and I'll explain implication that is derive the diagram related to explain implication 2 again. Implication 2 or second implication. The second part of the theorem states that The second part of the theorem states that states that an increase in the supply of one factor, will always lead to a reducing of the worsening করো WORSENING worsening of the terms of trade, worsening of the terms of trade, worsening of the terms of trade, or the relative price of the commodity or the relative price of the commodity using হ্যাঁ কোথা থেকে বলবো ওই the supply of one factor will always lead to a worsening of the terms of trade or the relative price of the commodity using relatively much of that factor, using relatively much of that factor. Meaning, in case one, when you consider labor increases, what is the impact? QX rises and QY falls, which implies QX by QY rises, where X is labor intensive. And under case 2, when your capital increases, QX falls and QY increases. So the QX by QY, these are actually the supply. I take S means supply. So the relative supply reduces. So up to this, any doubt? Up to this, our first part of the theorem. Huh? Up to this, okay?
Yes, sir.
Now we take a very simple tool, that is relative supply of X, relative demand for X. Px by Py. This is relative supply of X. This is relative demand for X. So this is Px by Py. What is relative supply of X? That is Qx supply Sx by Sy. What is relative demand for X? Dx by dy, like that. Or you may write Qx by Qy, this is Cx by Cy. The consumption means demand. So take a similar graph, relative supply, relative demand. Sorry, this is relative demand, this is relative supply. In case one, when labor rises, what is the impact on the supply of X? Relative supply of X rises. So when rises, the relative supply Relative supply rises. False. Here, Qx by Qy false means if relative supply of X falls, just see. Just see. Here, ultimately, X is worse off and here X is better off. So this is basically called biased growth. So though the biased growth topic is not directly mentioned in our syllabus, but later we'll discuss this biased growth. That means if there is any kind of, that means if you produce more, it may hamper your terms of trade. Suppose you are labor abundant, HO theorem, you produce labor intensive goods. In your economy, further labor rises. So if you produce more in the world market, then ultimately your commodity becomes cheaper, relatively cheaper. So you are worse off. Your TOT, terms of trade, can fall. Okay. Similarly, if you are capital abundant, okay, if your supply of capital rises in the economy, then ultimately, so Px by Py rises and Px by Py falls. So when your relative supply, we like good news for production and bad news, or good news for farming, be bad news for farmers, so like that. So this is the impact on the TOT. Okay, Rivnitsky theorem. Clear up to this?
স্যার মুছবেন না।
না মুছবো না, এগুলো দুটো গ্রাফকে অ্যাড করলাম। সেই ইমপ্লিকেশনের জায়গাগুলো লিখিয়ে দিলাম, ওগুলো পড়ে তারপরে এই জায়গাটা কভার করবে। Okay.
স্যার ডান।
Okay. Question. Suppose that at current factor prices, cloth is produced using suppose that at current factor prices, cloth is produced using 20 hours of labor for each acre of land. cloth producing 20 hours of labor with 1 acre of land, and food is producing 5 hours with 1 acre of land. 5 hours of labor per acre of land.
Food is produced using
So same line. By using 5 hours of labor per acre of land. Produced using only 5 hours of labor per acre of land. Suppose that, question number 8. Suppose that the economy's total resources are, suppose that the economy's total resources are 600 hours of labor and 60 acres of land.
Suppose that
The economy's total resources are suppose that the economy's total resources are 600 hours of labor and 60 acres of land. Using a diagram, determine the allocation of resources. Using a diagram, determine the allocation of resources. The application. So according to the information, ALC 20, ATC 1, ALF 5, ATF 1. Total labor is 600, total T bar is 60. Rishabh, ক্লাসে
হ্যাঁ
আছো?
স্যার হ্যাঁ স্যার
বলো, cloth and food, which one is labor intensive and which one is land intensive? Fine.
স্যার স্যার ক্লোথটা লেবার ইন্টেন্সিভ আর ফুডটা বোধহয় আরেকটা যেটা ল্যান্ড ইন্টেন্সিভ।
বোধ হয়।
হ্যাঁ স্যার L/T তো L/T ওটার বেশি 20/1।
হ্যাঁ, L/T, ALC by ATC is
হ্যাঁ ওটা
20
বেশি, ওটা হচ্ছে
and ALF by ATC. So labor land ratio is greater. So here ALC by ATC. Okay. Suppose you take, you measure land vertically. If you take land vertically, then take ATC by ALC. Huh? This one, land labor ratio. This one is less than ATF by ALF. So land labor ratio is greater in favor of food. So food is land intensive,
ল্যান্ড।
cloth is labor intensive. Up to this, okay? First, our objective is to find out the resource allocation, then diagram. So what about resource allocation this time? Resource allocation is here. Let cloth production is QC and this is QA. ALC into QC plus ALF into QF equals to L bar. This is your labor constraint, and ATC into QC plus ATF into QF. This is your T bar. Any doubt? Land constraint. To produce 1 unit of cloth, labor demand ALC. So to produce QC amount of cloth into QC. To produce 1 unit of cloth, labor requirement is ALC. So to produce QC amount, ALC into QC. Similarly, to produce this amount, 1 unit of food, labor requirement. So QF amount of food, this into that. So this is total demand for labor in cloth sector, total demand for labor in food sector. So this is total demand for labor and equals to L bar. Equals to L bar. So this is 20 QC plus QF equals to 600. Sorry, 5 QF. And this is QC plus QF equals to 60. So first solve and find out QC star and QF star. Solve and calculate for that. QC star, QF star. Anyone please calculate.
Sir,
QC
QC
20 and
20
QA 40.
QC star,
20,
20 আর QA 40
40.
20 and 40.
হ্যাঁ
Huh?
স্যার হ্যাঁ স্যার
20 and 40. Okay. Up to this, anyone, any doubt? Okay. Okay. Look. But you have to determine not QC and QF. Why? Because you have to determine the value. To take this one is cloth labor intensive. So OC, food OF. This total value is 600. And that height is basically 60. Eito, in our box. So along this you measure LC, along that TC, along this LF, along that TF. So look, in that graph, you have to calculate LC1, TC1. You already know. You know TC. This is TF1, LF1. So according to our question, you have to find out this distribution. Now, is this possible to find out the distributions? Huh? the distribution, that is the value. Shayantoni,
হ্যাঁ স্যার
value,
স্যার
হ্যাঁ
বলছি স্যার ওই L1C ওটা কি 400 আসবে?
কি করে আসবে বলো?
স্যার
ঠিক
এক
আছে।
ইউনিটের জন্য 20 লেবার, তাহলে 20
হ্যাঁ, very
ইউনিটের
good,
জন্য 20
very
into
good.
400 লেবার।
Your ALC equals to কত আছে? 20 hours. So to produce one cloth you require 20 hours. So what is your cloth production? 20 units. So what is your total labor in cloth sector? ALC into QC star, that is 400. Arey eta to labor demand. Look, when you take the equation ALC QC plus ALF QF equals to 600, that is equals to L bar. So this one is total demand for labor in cloth sector. So total demand for labor in food sector. So ALC into QC means this one. So total demand for labor. So this one is 400. So if this one is 400, total 600, that one is 200. আমি আর এত কিছু লিখছি না, দাও এগুলো সব 200, 400. So similarly, land 20 and
40 20 40
20 and 40. কোনটা 20 আছে?
ওই তো ফ্লোতে।
Cloth তো 20 and this one is 40. Bas, complete. Okay. Up to this, any confusion, any problem?